Look, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all. We've put a panel together here because you reflect different aspects of the resource management system. So whether that's infrastructure and delivery and housing, which is Patrick's charge, Gary, your passion for the environment and for the social outcomes that we're delivering in your history with EDS, Lesley, in terms of implementing or providing advice to government and also providing advice to local government on how to run the system. And Daniel, with your experience working particularly in the legal system itself, but also working and advocating for a lot of infrastructure providers. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to canvass a number of questions from you about the challenges that you see with the system. And I thought maybe what I would do is give an opening question. We've heard a lot today about some of the pressures that infrastructure and delivering infrastructure is providing and the environmental outcomes. We've heard about the pressures of climate change and the need that we need in terms of response to COVID. And I would just like observations from each of you, and if I can start with you, Patrick, at that end and work our way through, on how you see what the big challenges are in the areas that you're working in terms of the current system, and you know, what's your challenge in terms of delivering what you're looking to deliver in terms of infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Amelia. I've also been asked to just do a little introduction at the start, is that right?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, so Patrick Dougherty with Kāinga, and my role there is General Manager of Construction and Innovation, and I lead the public housing construction program. But I guess I should probably also start with my experience goes back, because I'm a grandfather, so I'm pretty old, 35 plus years in the development game, spending 25 years of those in the private mezzanine funded residential development sector. So I've got some experience across about 12 years in public housing as well as 25 years in the private. In terms of your question about some of the challenges, I guess having been around when the 91 Act actually came about, I actually sadly remember the adjustment that we had to go through. And I feel that the biggest challenge that I've seen is going from the Town Planning Act approach that we had prior to the 91 Act coming out. We never really adjusted, well, didn't for many, many years, adjusting how that was actually administered. And so we ended up going into an effects-based approach, but with a compliance approach. And so the struggle that we've continually had in the industry trying to get things built is having the confidence to know that what was going to happen through the process was something that we could actually forecast. And it was always a bit of a guess. And because of that, it stunted so much investment in so many development areas. That's probably the first point I'd start with, Amelia.
Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. I'd like to start with the bigger picture. It's important to remember that these islands we lived in were formed about 80 million years ago. They evolved a unique flora and fauna, free from any mammalian predators. And about 800 years ago, the first peoples arrived, and with them the first pulse of extinctions. And then a second wave of people arrived, and a second and more traumatic pulse of extinctions occurred. And so today, only 10% of the wetlands that were habitat to so many of our bird species are left in New Zealand. About 20% of our coastal forests are left, which were once teeming with bird life. Biodiversity is still tanking across many indicators, and something like 4,000 species are at or near extinction today. Many of our fabulous unique bird species have gone altogether. So my contention here is that when we talk about resource management system reform, we need to think about our natural heritage. The legislation that's proposed is a Natural and Built Environments Act. And in many ways, I think that nature is infrastructure. It just depends on how you look at it and where you draw the margins between them. So I think that collectively as people here, 800 years, 80 million years of evolution, we've now got a responsibility. We've got good science now We know what we've done, and I think we've got the wit and the will to fix it. And so that's why I think this legislation is as much about planning the restoration of that lost natural heritage, of doing landscape scale restoration with philanthropic and volunteer effort across New Zealand, and with business support across New Zealand, as it is about addressing the urgent social problems and inequities in our cities.
Thanks, Gary.
Kia ora, everyone. Unlike Gary, I do need to introduce myself, I think. I'm Lesley Baddon, and I work for the Ministry for the Environment. I work at the Auckland office. I'm part of a group of government agencies who work together principally on Auckland issues and on urban. I had the joyful task of running around after the panel, pretty much doing what I was told, occasionally offering an opinion and mostly get battered down, but that's fine, that's what I do for a living. In terms of the challenge for me, I have to go, I'm afraid, right down to the regulatory framework that MFE and I have responsibility for administering. And I think the real challenge that I see is that we do absolutely need, and for the reasons that Gary's outlined, for both, I think, the built and the natural environment, a real modern fit-for-purpose regulatory system. And that's one that I think means a much better relationship between government, market, community than the RME has produced. And I think one of the things we all learned with the panel approach was that if you looked at the purpose and principles, I think it was very clear on the role of Maori in the system. It looked really good in principle, and we talked to lots of people who said there's nothing wrong with the RMA, it's just what people do with it, they just don't do the right thing. Well, for me, that's not a good regulatory framework, because it has to work and it has to be usable by people and understood by people. And I think that's a big challenge. Certainly, MFE and I have.
Thanks, Lesley. Daniel.
Kia ora, everyone. Daniel Minhinnick. I'm a partner at McVeagh in the environment and planning area. For me, a large part of how we're involved in helping our clients is in helping them achieve something and building something and getting across the need for change. And so I think it's quite interesting as far as what Dean and Amelia were saying earlier, as far as the move away from the protection of the status quo. I see that as being a really important step change, particularly when you look at urban environments and the protection effectively given to amenity values. I see moving away from that static approach and towards recognition of the need to change being a really important leg up for development and infrastructure. Equally, I see that change being really important as far as helping with the restoration of our natural environments. And I think, stepping back, I think that the panel needs to really be applauded for what they've achieved through the report. I think that they have, in a reasonably short space of time, produced a really comprehensive report. It's not, though, a panacea. I think there are some adjacencies, particularly around local government and funding, that really need to be explored. And in that sense, it is a little bit of a shame that we do have this segregation at the moment, as far as all of us in this room talking about the planning system and everyone else downstairs talking about funding and financing. And then I think the other aspect, though, which also goes to that status quo aspect, is the cultural and resourcing challenges that our local government faces, and the way that manifests when developers or the infrastructure community then interact with local government.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to, now, these guys may have seen a few of my questions in advance, but they are going to have seen these ones because these have come from the floor. And Gary, I'd like to start with you, because I know you've been involved a lot in engagement with communities as you've got work through with EDS. But the question has come through, does the panel have a view on the need to strengthen iwi governance? So perhaps Gary and maybe Lesley, you'd have a comment to that as well.
Well, I think the panel had a view on that, and I guess it's one that was entirely consistent with the Environmental Defence Society's position, so it must have been a good position. And that is that there does need to be a strengthening of the ties between the treaty and the new resource management system. We need to get away from tokenism. I think that means that we need to start thinking, or not thinking, but implementing co-governance, that we need to have strong mana whenua involvement in plan making, in decision making about plans. And I think that's just the way of the future. That's our New Zealandness coming into play, isn't it?
Yeah. And Lesley, maybe you could provide a bit of comment on the capacity of Māori for that transition, because I know that's something that we've been talking about from the panel discussion side, and just from where, if MFE has any perspective on that as well, in making that kind of transition.
Yeah, I think there's a general understanding now that there needs to be an increase in capability and capacity across the system, and for Māori to participate the way the panel's proposals is intended, and certainly I think the way the government's thinking, then that has to be supported and that has to be funded. It's not going to happen without that. I think there's still a question about how that happens, and I think the principle that it should happen is definitely part of the process.
Excellent. Okay, maybe another general one, and this time we'll start Daniel and work that way. Look, we've made a number of recommendations from the panel's perspective about opportunities, setting outcomes and targets, but I'd be interested in exploring whether, from your perspective, there's any risks or threats in that model and that approach, and whether there is anything that sort of gives you pause for thought in terms of challenges going forward.
Certainly. So I think that one of the key challenges is that with the 20-odd outcomes that have been identified by the panel, there's a question about how you prioritise those. I think that inevitably there will be tensions and conflicts between those outcomes and what they each aspire to, and how those are reconciled will be a key issue. Otherwise, you effectively are over-promising and under-delivering. And so, from that perspective, I think wearing a development or infrastructure hat, I think there is a significant risk that it will end up with the ecological bottom lines inevitably prevailing and those outcomes prevailing. And so while the strategic planning aspects of the new framework will assist from an infrastructure perspective, I think, as Hamish mentioned this morning, I think there is a real risk that when it comes to how a planned infrastructure project goes against those outcomes, there's the real risk that there'll be major issues there.
Excellent, thank you. Right of reply or other comments from others in terms of that risk?
Well, it just sounded a bit deja vu, Daniel. I thought you sounded a bit pre-King Salmon in your comments. I mean, isn't the whole idea that we have environmental bottom lines or biophysical limits that are set and that you can't go below, and then the market does its thing above them?
Yeah, and I think on that there is what might be the limits. There's also then a question of how aspirational they might be, and also when you come to the outcomes, which are not necessarily linked to absolute bottom lines, but there will be tensions between those and how those outcomes still play out. I still think that there are real risks from that perspective.
Okay.
That could take another half an hour, I think, to resolve, but we'll leave it here.
Well, it gives us a flavour of some of the challenges, and I do think it is really important to go, we're certainly, as I think Dean indicated, the panel make the recommendations, we have to go through what that looks like, and I think it is perhaps optimistic, and I thought Jacinda's comment this morning really resonated. If there was a silver bullet to this issue, just as there is a silver bullet to infrastructure provision as an issue, I think we would have landed on it because we've been worrying about this for a while, and I don't think it's going to get rid of all of those tensions. But I think they're reasonable concerns. Patrick, turning to you, the Urban Development Act in July this year gave you new powers your agency, new powers in self-consenting, not you directly, one hopes. Given the new role, I just wondered if you had any observations or comments on how that system, how the existing system and that system might progress a bit, or where your opportunities are there in terms of change.
I guess the first thing I do is acknowledge that it does sometimes come across in the feedback I'm hearing. It looks like Kāinga is being treated differently than other players. But the intention is actually to be quite different. In fact, this is not so much about Kāinga having powers that allows it to develop its development program. It's actually to enable development to occur with the support of what the Act allows to occur. The example that we use the best is probably Hobsonville Point, which was ex-defence land, and with the work with Waitakere Council and the Crown through the subsidiary of Housing New Zealand at the time, Hobsonville Land Company, arriving at a plan and a master plan from which the development as we see now before us is quite an impressive example of medium density, which is really showcasing how medium density can apply through the rest of the city. That is the sort of thing we expect to see come out of that with the SDPs that can be created. In terms of how Kāinga might looking to use it for itself, it's actually not the intent. We are, I guess, stepping very much into understanding. If you go to Kāinga's name, it's called Kāinga Homes and Communities, and one of the key tasks that have been described in legislation, this is the one that set us up on the 1st of October last year, was to enable thriving communities. And so when we look at the powers that the Urban Development Act has created, it's actually expecting us to create ways to work in partnership with communities quite differently. I heard a previous speaker in this session talk about the change from doing things to communities and doing things with communities. And I think that's the key shift in terms of the attitude that needs to be applied. The vast majority of activity that Kāinga actually will undertake is typically within existing district plan provisions for itself, and when it does need to go outside that, it'll look to follow those processes. And as I say, the issues that the Urban Development Act is trying to resolve are ones that are much bigger that happen in the marketplace than just what's happening within the public housing space.
Thanks, Patrick. There's a question here from the floor which I think actually sort of mirrors my final question, but is better worded, so I'm going to use it. Many today see the RMA reform as a panacea for righting all the wrongs in New Zealand's economic and environmental prosperity. And I think that's a fair observation. What one element of reform do you see as making the most difference in making things positive difference? What's the one thing in the reforms in your mind that is the most positive opportunity to address that? I will go. Anyone can have a go.
Can I just be me and not, yeah. I think the Strategic Planning Act is the one that really could make the difference if it's done well. And I think that's the thing about the reforms. They need good ideas, good outcomes, objectives, but actually making sure it works. It's my previous point. But I think the Strategic Planning Act is where we've got the opportunity to really reset the system so that far more gets decided further up, that there is a far longer term, bigger, picking up Gary's ideas about the sorts of intergenerational thinking we should be doing. If you look at the pressures that the current system has, it's a big risk because it's brand new and it's an insertion into a system that's not used to these things, and we've got a lot to work through, but I think that's the thing that could really make the long-term biggest difference.
Thanks, Lesley.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say that. I think Hamish laid out the case for spatial planning this morning, but I think his problem was with the architecture of the legislation, having a separate spatial planning act. Well, I think that train has left the station, and he needs to get over it because there's no way. I mean, that is the train, and it's got momentum. Lesley could no doubt tell us more about the timeline, but my expectation is that that will be in at least 2 new Acts of Parliament during this term, 2 new Acts during this term. Drafting has started. You're not going to change the fundamental architecture. Where we need to get our act together as a joined-up community, and I mean, EDS was really pleased to work with Infrastructure New Zealand and EMA and Business New Zealand and the others to get the political mandate for these reforms essentially landed, and very keen to continue that work. But it's going to be now focusing on the second and third order details of how we can make the fundamental architecture work. And that's where I think there is devil in the detail around spatial planning, the connectivity with the funding side of things. But spatial planning is definitely the big game in town. I reckon it's the big game breaker. And I think if I was going to add something to that, I'd say local government reform. Too many local councils. We've got one council with 1.5 million people in Auckland. We've got another council with, 30,000 people in Mackenzie district. I mean, those disjunctions are just, ridiculous, and we need to get over ourselves.
And look, I know that was something that the panel did turn its mind to quite hard, and I know that the Planning Institute themselves looked a bit disappointed that we didn't have spatial planning in the main act, because I think it provided the panacea, perhaps, of one ring to rule them all, but what it didn't do was address how were we going to bring the issues you raised, Daniel, how we were going to bring funding and financing in. And I think if we went down that path, that was going to be a very difficult avenue to get one piece of legislation covering all of that, where a spatial planning process might be able to tackle it.
Yeah, one brief comment on spatial planning. I completely agree. I think the other thing, particularly from an infrastructure perspective, is that the focus is very much on corridors, and so it's very much about roading and three waters. And I think looking forward, and you hear of the policy goal of going to 100% renewable, for example, some of those standalone pieces of infrastructure in terms of energy and social infrastructure, having those identified, particularly in the context of the bottom lines and the raft of environmental outcomes sought to be achieved as well, bringing those into the spatial planning process will be critical as well if we're able to deliver on the outcomes from an infrastructure perspective.
And you very nicely answered another question here, which was, and I'll give you an opportunity just to add to it if you wanted to. The question about decarbonising our economy is going to need significant renewable infrastructure, and you've just touched on some of it. And how could the system balance the need for those good impacts on the environment with the neighbour development impact issues? And I think that spatial planning, to me, as you just suggested, is a key mechanism there. But do you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, and I guess just building on that without being built into that strategic planning aspect, there's the real risk that unanticipated major infrastructure will just fail to get through the Natural and Built Environments Act. Yeah. And so you look at something like a pumped hydro or something like that, unless it was signalled through a strategic planning act and then the combined plan, a real risk that it would actually require specific enabling legislation to actually get through.
Yeah, assuming that you think of those things as static in time, but yes, yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Does anyone else want to add to that, Gary or Patrick, anything?
I just wanted to sort of finish my comment off with the issue that we really have to face is something I mentioned at the very start is when we go into an outcomes-focused approach, that we need to make sure the work we do on agreeing what those outcomes are is done. And it has to be, like Gary said, across the entire community. There has to be an agreed way of dealing with this, and that was the challenge that I was referring to when we had the RMA came out, and we didn't actually have an accepted approach that was across the entire industry. And so the work that is required of us now is to get that in place. It's all very well, to Lesley's point, having the legislation change, but it's going to be failure if we don't actually put in place how it's actually created. And so when I think about the difference in my simple way, we have to continue to protect what we needed to protect in the past, but this is about planning for the future, whereas the RMA seemed to be more focused on protecting what we had. So when you came into a community and said you wanted to build a 5-storey apartment building next to some single-level houses, that was never going to succeed if you're going to operate under the old way. But it may be that we have to see what is the future meant to look like, and allows us to have that kind of thinking in our spatial planning.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point there, Patrick, and I know Daniel and I have had a bit of a conversation about this, but Lesley, it'd be good to give you an opportunity to respond as well, about the degree of culture change needed in our system, and certainly that was something that, for my sins, saw the transition from 1990 to 1991, and all the lack of transition and how that worked from a culture perspective. Daniel, do you have any comments about that from an issue perspective, and then maybe give Lesley a chance to think about what MFE is considering?
Certainly. It's, I think the panel's report identifies the resourcing, the capability and capacity challenges for local government, and unless that is grappled with, we'll, as an infrastructure industry, continue to face a number of the same battles we are today, under a different acronym as far as what the legislation is. And so grappling with that, and I don't know whether the government has the same inclination on that aspect as it does on the legislative framework side of things, but that's critical from my perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's 30 years of a particular sort of culture, and that didn't start. There was a lot that came through from the Town and Country Planning Act before that. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and that is something that, as I was saying before, with regulation, it's got to work with the environment that it's in, but also at times it's got to drive the change. And we've got a very litigious, a very complicated, very devolved kind of environment, and a lot of set expectations to work with. One of the things the Minister is looking at is the potential to be producing, and we're calling it model plans because we're not sure exactly where they would be, but there's the potential to find at least one and potentially two places in New Zealand that are ready to work with us as we're developing the legislation, so that we can actually road test it as we go. So it's quite a different approach, and it will take resources to do, but I think it will be something really important. What was really missing from the RMA in terms of any kind of guidance, Minister Park has been really clear. One of his big gaps with the RMA was that there was nothing that looked like a plan for anybody to work to. So he's quite keen that by the time we finish the process, there's something that looks pretty much doable, at least one example to work with.
And maybe that's a call for us as well as leaders in the industry. This is the opportunity that we have to sort of drive some of that culture change as well. Perhaps another a reverse question in terms of
could I do a culture change piece? I mean, I think you've touched on it. You know, we've got some very ambitious climate change goals, both 2030 and 2050. We're on a pathway to decarbonise our economy, and all the people at this conference have a role to play in that. And I think we need to start thinking about, you know, the kind of infrastructure that helps with that. You know, electrifying the transport fleet, fantastic, let's get on with it. I mean, that's low-hanging fruit in terms of CO2 emission reductions. And I just think, you know, the way we manage fresh water is another sort of thing that we need to, you know, have very much in mind. We've got freshwater reforms coming through. We've got the Three Waters reforms coming through. There's a truckload of infrastructure bill to go on there to fix it. And then finally, with respect to sort of spatial planning, let's remember that the panel also recommended that it should go out into the coastal marine area. Yes. So it's also about our oceans. And guess what? The Minister for the Environment is now the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries. So there's going to be more change over this 3-year term than certainly I've ever seen. And I was around in 1991.
Thank you for that. Look, we actually, I still have a few more questions from the audience, which I'm probably not going to have time to get through, but I know people will be happy to stand around and answer those questions directly, so if people want to come up. But Lesley, I did want to just give you the opportunity, and I know that your role is advising the government into action and what areas they're focusing on, but I wondered if you could give us some insight, and Gary alluded to his understanding of that, on what you're thinking, where you're going, what priorities and advice you've been asked, just to get a sense of timing for change.
Well, Gary probably knows more than me. So, Minister Parker, I had some 4 Ps in my head because my memory's not that great. Pace, so as he's indicated, he wants everything done and dusted this parliamentary term. I still wish it was 4 years instead of 3, my goodness. The UK one at 5 was good. Secondly, he wants to push ahead with the Natural and Built Act, as he calls it, and very, very quickly. So things are happening in that. The Strategic Planning Act, he also wants done in the same time frame. However, we're looking at the moment about different forms of vehicle for delivering that legislation, and that's using the new Public Services Act provisions. Now, we're not sure if that's going to work, but chief executives across the system, so the ones in particular that are affected by the Strategic Planning Act, are already working together looking at potential models. So that's where the Public Services Act is new. This would be the first one up. And it's about addressing some of the kind of silos that central government agencies tend to work in. So this is a perfect proposal for it. There's just a question about how much or little would be in that sort of process, and how much would still be driven solely by MFE with people helping. The second thing is partnership. So the panel were very clear, and Gary's raised the words co-governance, but the principle of the new approach is around a far better, more realistic, well, meaningful partnership around decision making. And we're recommending that's built into the process of developing the legislation itself. So those are the 3 Ps: Public Services Act, PACE, and the partnership. And all of those add up to quite a problem, my last P, in the time that we've got. So we're really working that through, and we're being very active. There's lots of conversations going along. The role of local government's another one. I see the potential for developing those model plans as being a real working relationship that we can do. Yeah, so that's where we're at the moment. In terms of process, in terms of the participation, that was another P. I think the minister's of the view, and I think he's made it clear, that there's been a lot of discussion about the need for change. The panel report included conversations right across the country. So his view is that we go straight ahead into the legislative process, and there's a couple, at least one, select committee, really thorough select committee processes, and that's where the focus for participation would be, and that's where, if I were in this room and not me, I would be thinking about putting my resources.
So people should take the brave step of reading that tome?
Yes, Amelia will remember that Minister Barker was very keen that we actually printed them. We were really good with recycled paper and things, but he felt it was really important to have a solid, obvious report. Cool. As a train.
Doorstop.
Yeah, I call it a height improver. I stand on it to reach cupboards.
It's good with Zoom calls.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think the point is we can expect change. We can expect change quite soon, which is good because we've been talking about it for a long time. And I suppose today's been a bit of an entree to what that change will look like. But and there will be opportunities to participate. But it sounds like it's going to be a roller coaster ride in terms of the pace that he's looking for. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. And as I said, thank you for the questions. There's still 3 or 4 on the pad here, and really happy to hang around and try and answer them, and cobble a few others here who I'm sure will do that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That's great.